Okay, picture this. A world just ripped apart by war, so traumatized that it's willing to try anything to make sure it never happens again. Well, that was the world in 1920. And that anything they tried, it was called the League of Nations. So the big question is, did this huge, world-first experiment actually work? Was it a success or a failure? That's what we're going to dig into.
You know, after what they called the war to end all wars, the world was desperate for a new idea. And what they came up with was, well, it was a radical dream. The League of Nations had one single massive goal: to make sure the horrors of the trenches, that industrial-scale killing, could never, ever happen again. I mean, this was humanity's first real attempt at creating some kind of global body to keep the peace.
So you might be asking, how was this thing supposed to actually stop wars? Well, it all came down to one revolutionary idea: collective security. The principle was actually pretty simple, but it was powerful. The idea was, an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. Everyone would team up to stop the aggressor. It was supposed to be such a powerful threat that nobody in their right mind would even think about starting a war.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with that dream of peace and some of the League's early wins, and yeah, there were some. Then we'll look at the cracks in the foundation, which led to a total collapse in the 1930s. And finally, we'll try to come to a verdict on the whole thing.
Okay, so let's get into it. It's so easy to just write the League off as a total failure, right? But the thing is, in its early days, it actually had some incredible successes. For a while there, in the 1920s, it looked like this crazy idea might actually work.
And here's the proof. I mean, look at these cases. These were real-deal international disputes that could have easily blown up into full-scale wars. You had Sweden and Finland about to go at it over the Åland Islands. The League stepped in, made a decision, and boom, war averted. Same thing with Germany and Poland in Upper Silesia. And get this, when Greece invaded Bulgaria, the League basically told them to knock it off, and they did. They actually pulled their troops back. For that first decade, the system was working.
But it wasn't just about stopping wars. This is the side of the League people almost never talk about. It's incredible humanitarian work. We're talking about laying the groundwork for modern human rights. They established the International Labor Organization, which is still around today. They helped almost 500,000 prisoners of war get back home. They created a special passport for refugees who had nowhere to go, and they started the first ever global campaigns against things like disease, slavery, and drug trafficking. This stuff was absolutely groundbreaking for its time.
And if you want to see the real human impact of that work, just look at this number. On the Tenyi-Gingo Railway project in Africa, the death rate for workers was a horrifying 55%. More than half the workers were dying. The League stepped in, demanded better, safer conditions, and that number dropped all the way down to 4%. Think about that. That's a massive number of lives saved. So, if a League could do all this good stuff, why do we think of it as such a disaster? Well, because for all its good work, the whole thing was built on some incredibly shaky ground.
Yeah, for all those early victories and good intentions, the League had some major problems baked right into its DNA from the very beginning. And when things got tough, those cracks in the foundation were about to bring the whole house down.
This cartoon from the time says it all, really. It shows a bridge, the League of Nations, but there's a huge gap in the middle. And who's walking away? Uncle Sam, the United States. The crazy thing is, the League was the brainchild of the US President, Woodrow Wilson, but Congress refused to join. So the most powerful country on the planet, the one piece they absolutely needed to make the whole thing work, was missing from day one. It was a fatal flaw right from the start.
And the problems didn't stop there. First off, the League had no army of its own, no teeth. If it wanted to enforce a decision, it had to ask its members to volunteer troops, and good luck with that. Then there's the voting. For any big decision, the vote had to be unanimous. Unanimous. Can you imagine trying to get everyone to agree on something in a crisis? One single country could say no and bring the whole process to a screeching halt. Ultimately, it always came down to the same thing. Countries were just more worried about their own interests than they were about this idea of collective security.
You know who summed it up perfectly? Of all people, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. He said, "The League is very well when sparrows shout, but no good at all when eagles fall out." And he was spot on. The League could handle arguments between the little guys, the sparrows, but when the big, powerful nations, the eagles, decided to do what they wanted, the League was totally helpless. They could just ignore it, and they did. So then came the 1930s. The Great Depression hits, dictators are on the rise, and suddenly those eagles Mussolini was talking about, they started falling out in a big way. And those cracks we talked about in the League's foundation, well, they were about to cause a total system failure. And it happened fast.
Just look at this timeline. It's like a series of dominoes falling, one after the other. Each time the League failed to stand up to an aggressor, it sent a crystal-clear message to every other dictator watching. The rules don't apply to you. You can get away with it. Each failure just made them bolder and pushed the world closer and closer to another disaster.
The first big test, the first domino to fall, was Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. China went to the League begging for help, and what did the League do? It set up a committee, which took over a year just to write a report. A whole year. By the time they finally got around to condemning Japan, the Japanese ambassador basically just laughed, walked out of the meeting, and left the League for good. Japan kept Manchuria, and the League did absolutely nothing. And you could bet the rest of the world was taking notes.
But if Manchuria was the first crack, the invasion of Abyssinia by Mussolini's Italy was the moment the whole thing shattered. This time, the League actually did something. They imposed sanctions. But they were a joke, a complete farce. They refused to sell Italy guns, but they didn't ban the sale of oil, the one thing Mussolini's war machine desperately needed. Why? Because Britain and France were terrified of pushing Mussolini into an alliance with Hitler. So they chose their own self-interest over defending a fellow member. It was a disastrous calculation.
And then, it got even worse. It turned out the fatal blow came from the inside. While Britain and France were publicly talking tough, they were secretly cooking up a deal, the Horle-Laval Pact, to just hand over most of Abyssinia to Mussolini. They got caught. The plan was leaked to the press, and people were furious. It exposed the League's most powerful members as total hypocrites. The credibility? Gone. Utterly destroyed. So, with the League now seen as a joke, a new, much more dangerous idea took over. Appeasement. Basically, world leaders completely gave up on the idea of collective security. They figured the only way to prevent a war was to go around the League and make personal deals with the dictators, giving people like Hitler what they wanted in the hopes that it would satisfy them. We all know how well that turned out.
Okay, so let's try and reach a verdict here. It's pretty obvious the League failed at its #1 job, preventing another world war. But does that mean the whole thing was a complete waste of time? Or was it something else? Maybe a necessary failure?
So let's put it all on the table. On the one hand, the failures are huge and impossible to ignore. It didn't stop World War II. The big powers walked all over it. Its sanctions were totally ineffective. But on the other hand, you have to remember the successes. It was the very first attempt at this kind of global organization. It did amazing work for human and labor rights. And for the first time ever, it gave smaller countries a real seat at the table.
And this is maybe the most important takeaway. The League didn't just crash and burn and vanish. It served as a lesson, a painful but incredibly valuable lesson. It became the blueprint for what came next, the United Nations. In fact, the UN was specifically designed to avoid the League's biggest mistakes. That's why it has a Security Council that can actually take action. So in a way, the ghost of the League is still with us, serving as a powerful reminder of the price of failure.
So that leaves us with a really tricky question. On the one hand, the League of Nations was a spectacular failure at its main goal. But on the other, it created the very idea of the international system we rely on today. So what do you think? Was it just a naive, failed experiment? Or was it an absolutely essential first try? A necessary failure on the long, difficult road to building a better world? There's really no easy answer to that one.